We're joined today by Giran Ozcan, the representative of the People's Democratic Party in Turkey. He is an important voice here in Washington, D.C., and a partner of the Armenian National Committee on a whole range of issues dealing with democracy, with domestic affairs, with regional affairs. We're very, very fortunate that he's joined us today. Giran, thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me, ARAM.
Could we start today by sharing a bit about the history of the party that you represent here in Washington, the People's Democratic Party? I know that there's a long democratic tradition related to the work of the party. It goes back decades. And could you share with us just how the party is where the party is today?
Again, thank you very much for having me and giving me the opportunity to speak about both my party, my people, and the kind of struggle that we're undertaking in Turkey, and also what we do here in DC. So Kurdish politics in Turkey does, as you said, it dates all the way back to the founding of the Republic, and this resistance, the politics of all of it has been handled in very many different ways throughout the history of the Republic. But the Kurds only had the audacity to actually form a political party that would contest elections in Turkey in the early 90s, when there were Kurdish members of parliament in Turkish parties, in mainstream Turkish political parties, social democratic parties in the late 80s. Kurdish members of parliament, Kurdish people would contest elections under the name of these mainstream Turkish parties. Until 1990, when several members of parliament, Kurdish members of parliament, attended a Kurdish conference in France. And on their return to Turkey, simply for attending this conference, an international conference in France on the Kurds, they were kicked out of the party. That's what pushed the first Kurds to actually form their own, what are generally termed pro-Kurdish political parties in Turkey. And that's where it all started. So since 1990, the Kurds have formed several parties along the same lines. The Turkish state has largely reacted by closing each party, especially after election successes. Kurdish members of parliament, Kurdish politics being in mainstream Turkish politics, being a part of the Turkish election cycle, was not something that the Turkish state was very much prepared to take. And so since the early 90s, the Turkish state has resorted to banning political parties, banning Kurdish politicians, but the Kurds have always found a way around this. And there's a very popular joke now that the Kurds have almost exhausted every single letter of the alphabet in trying to form new political parties in Turkey. And the HDP comes from this rich history. So for over 30 years, the Kurds have formed pro-Kurdish political parties. But what separates the HDP from a lot of the predecessors is that with the HDP there was this theoretical breakthrough, a paradigm shift, in that largely the issues that we were facing as a Kurdish people were derivative of, or were brought about as a result of, the authoritarian and illiberal nature and characteristic of the Turkish state. And so to pursue Kurdish rights, to demand Kurdish rights, by definition meant the democratization of Turkey, because the Kurds never had the opportunity to voice these demands, let alone try and formulate certain solutions or bring about these rights being given. They weren't even allowed to voice these rights. And that's why, for example, in Turkey, certain Kurdish political actors have resorted to other means of trying to pursue politics and pursue Kurdish rights. But the HDP, after all of this experience in the last 30 years, saw that the democratization of Turkey has to be at the center of what the Kurds are demanding, because there are very many other portions of Turkish society, not just Kurds, but the rest of Turkish society, other factions, marginalized factions, other ethnicities who have lived in those lands for thousands of years, like the Armenians, like other religious minorities who have called these lands home for thousands of years, well predating the foundation of the Turkish Republic. And that these people needed a platform to form a synergy to actually challenge the authoritarian and illiberal nature of the Turkish state. And I think the HDP is a culmination of over 30 years of experience from the Kurds in countering the Turkish state's authoritarian reflexes and bringing about every oppressed minority in Turkey forming a joint a platform, unifying the strengths of these very many minorities to really change the discourse and be stronger in parliament, be stronger in mainstream politics, not just allow for the Turkish state to divide every single minority and marginalize them perpetually.
And it seems that the success of the HDP has sparked once again a very strong reaction from the Turkish state. We saw that I think the last wave of repression, I would maybe say, is in the last 4 or 5 years. But presently, there's this very heavy pressure on the party in the form of thousands of leaders who've been in prison. Threats now, I understand, of hundreds more who may be either banned from politics or imprisoned themselves. And then the potential of the full closure of the party. Where do things stand? Where do things stand right now, Giran?
So yeah, the last round of repression started after the 2015 elections, when the HDP scored an unprecedented electoral success. There's a 10% threshold that's placed in the Turkish electoral system, effectively just banning representation of minorities in Turkey. And all the predecessor parties of the HDP would fall just short of that 10% threshold. And so the HDP, or the predecessor parties, would largely contest the elections through independent members of parliament. So we wouldn't enter the elections as a party, just so we can circumvent that 10% threshold. But with the HDP and unifying the strength of very many minorities in Turkey, the HDP had the self-confidence to actually enter the elections as a party and really just smash through that 10% threshold. And in 2015, this is what happened. The HDP scored 13.1% in the elections. And since then, as a result of the HDP crossing the threshold, the AKP, Erdogan, was unable to form a government because he had lost his majority. Up until then, because the Kurds were unable to cross that threshold, all the members of parliament that would normally be won by the HDP would actually be taken by the first party, which was, for the last 20 years almost, has been the AKP. But since 2015, once Erdogan realized that the HDP could easily cross that threshold now, he resorted to other means of crackdown. And that's why we have more than 4,000 members of our party in prison right now. We have members of parliament in prison right now. All the local municipalities that we won in the most recent municipal elections have been completely illegally taken over by the Turkish government. And our co-mayors have largely been put in prison again. Our former co-chairs, Selahattin Demirtas and Figen Yüksekdağ, who scored that unprecedented victory in 2015, who led that electoral campaign, are in prison and have been in prison for almost 5 years now. And yeah, so the crackdown now is, it's bringing together two very strong emotions and reflexes in the Turkish state. One being the immense crackdown on any kind of non-Turkish organization, non-Turkish organizing, non-Turkish voicing of demands, and also Erdogan's relentless his relentless push to consolidate as much power as possible in his person. And these two have now come together in the form of a very racist coalition that is being run by Erdogan's party and the ultra-nationalist, and I definitely call fascist, MHP, which is the Nationalist Movement Party, that is a signatory to the undersigner of every single fascistic approach the Turkish state has taken since, at least for the last 30, 40 years. Being served by this coalition are not taking their foot off the gas at all. And now we can see the Turkish army operating in several theaters across the region. Domestically, every single non-Turkish descent, and actually Turkish descent even now, is being repressed. But regionally, the Turkish army is operating in Nagorno-Karabakh, in Libya, in Syria, in Iraq, against Kurds, against Armenians, against Arabs, everywhere. This marriage between two parties, one with this nationalistic, fascistic strive to just really expand Turkish designs in the region, and the other to just consolidate as much power as possible in his person and really enrich himself, his friends, and his family.
Yeah, Giran, I think that there's really you can't draw a very distinct line between the domestic and foreign policy anymore. They all kind of blur together. The domestic abuse, the regional aggression. There's a phrase that's I don't know the words in Turkish, but in the English translation is something like remnants of the sword. Remnants of the sword, and sometimes Armenians are grouped into the remnants of the sword. Basically, those that the Turks didn't get around to killing in 1915, they're still scattered across the landscape, and we need to kind of like finish them off. I think that Erdogan has extended that definition to include the region. Right? There's others he hasn't finished off yet, and not just those within Turkey itself, but as you mentioned, the war on Nagorno-Karabakh, the threats against Armenia itself. It's a very, very scary combination of this domestic political ambition, and then you add to it the regional designs, the regional expansionist aspirations, and it becomes a really, really dangerous combination. It's clear that the success of the HDP is being met with such a repressive response by Erdogan, precisely because they know they can't compete in the electoral landscape. That 13% might, in a year's time or at the next election, be 20% or more than that. And I think that's why this 4,000 leaders in jail. If he felt that, if Erdogan felt that he could compete in the political landscape, he'd surely be competing in the political landscape, and he would secure votes and prove his electoral dominance. But if putting people in jail is a sure sign that he's not confident about that. It seems that that 2015 or so watershed in Turkey has also been matched in a sense by a growing awareness in the West, especially here in Washington, that Turkey's not the partner it once was. Let me say this. I'm not going to say that the U.S. has become more concerned about democracy. I will say that they've become less inclined to overlook Turkey's shortcomings in democracy because of the geopolitics of Erdogan. And that's, in the end, a healthy development. I would say that your work here and the HDP's work in Washington has contributed to this. It's brought like another voice to the discussion to diversify how the U.S. relates to this part of the world, instead of just saying, everything we do is derivative of, what Turkey or Erdogan or an AKP party wants. No, it's like, well, no, that's maybe the beginning of the discussion, but it's not the end of the discussion. The Kurdish issue needs to be discussed on its own merits. It has its own channel. There should be a U.S. policy on Kurdish issues. There should be a U.S. policy on democracy within Turkey that is not just managed by Erdogan. We care or don't care based on what he gives us or doesn't give us, regionally. And as well, I look at the Armenian issue. The Armenian issue needs to have its own channel. It needs to stand or fall on its own merits, not just based on, what the dictatorial leadership in Ankara demands. And I think I've seen that, I've seen progress on this front. They're not necessarily on the issues that maybe would be highest on our list, but on sanctions regarding arms sales or the imprisonment. You recall of Pastor Brunson certainly sparked a very strong response in the U.S. How can we encourage that to extend to issues of democracy, issues of Kurdish democratic aspirations? How can we be part of this debate in the think tank world? I know you're very active in working with experts and with the officials here in D.C. What do you see? How do you see this developing?
So, Aram, I mean, I will firstly always defer to you when analyzing the approach from DC, the outlook from DC. You're just that much better, and so yeah, after you've given that kind of an outlook from DC, what I want to specifically say is mention the reading from the Turkish establishment about the US, because I believe that the Turkish establishment right now sees the US hegemony is receding, especially US hegemony in the Middle East, US authority in the Middle East, the US's weight in the Middle East is receding. And the Turkish establishment believes that there's a void there to be filled, and they think they can fill it. And I think that's where a lot of this unreliability, instability that the Turkish state is causing in the region comes from that specific reading. And I think because the Turkish establishment reads it in this way, because they feel that the US is just simply not as important as it once was in the region, I feel that they think they can operate more freely, that they can now push their weight around a little more freely, that they don't have to see themselves as an extension of American regional policy, but they themselves can actually be an agent of their own designs on the region. And in all honesty, they are making their moves. Now, maybe the Turkish state's reading of American influence in the region is maybe too exaggerated, but I do feel that yes, in the US, the Middle East is now playing second fiddle to another region, right? So this pivot to Asia that's been talked about for around 10 years is giving people in the region the idea that, well, we're just not as important for America anymore, and that's why we're seeing regional countries making new alliances. I mean, the Abraham Accords that were talked about just over about a year ago with the UAE and Israel and other Gulf countries now warming to relations with Israel and patching things over with them. And while largely people think that this is in response to Iran's expansionists or destabilizing policies in the region, I think that this, to a certain extent, if not more, is at the very least a response to the Turkish state's operations in the region too. I don't think there's any love lost between the Gulf countries towards Turkey. I mean, I since the Ottoman Empire, I don't want to get into too much historical comparisons at this stage, but there is definitely a distrust of Turkish intentions in the region, especially being backed up now by the operations that I mentioned earlier as well. And so I think while people in the region are making alternative plans for not when the US necessarily leaves the region, but even this limited interactions or lesser, even this decreased American footprint in the region is pushing people to make new adjustments, realignments, and we're seeing that play out. Now, the unfortunate thing here is that Turkey, rather than realigning itself or trying to find a regional balance that might be suitable for everyone, that might be productive for everyone, it's really engaged in this very one-sided unilateral expansion in trying to really become the regional hegemon. And I just think that comes from a very unhealthy place, in that Turkey neither has the economy or the culture, the political culture, to be able to pull that off in the region. And that's why we're seeing very many people in the region really concerned about what Turkey wants to represent right, we can all accept that the US might not engage like it once did. We can all accept that the US is not going to be the unilateral hegemon, or the one superpower in the region that can determine a lot of the outcomes that people keep an eye on. But in the absence of that, the peoples of the region can come together and try and make their own internal balance a bit more productive and a bit more stable for the peoples of the region. And I just don't think people believe that Turkey has those intentions. And I think they themselves have shown people that largely that's not why they are, sending soldiers into Syria. That's not why they're sending soldiers into Iraq or Libya and Nagorno-Karabakh. I mean, everywhere they've sent soldiers, we've seen horrific stories come out. So I just think that rather than the change of heart occurring in DC, I believe we have to see the change of heart occurring in Ankara that DC is reacting to. I just feel that setting the stall that way gives us a better chance of actually analyzing what really is going on the ground.
Yeah, no, I think your analysis is like spot on. That's actually, we need more of that type of insight here in Washington. I think it really speaks very accurately to what we're facing. And in a sense, I don't know if you've seen this, but I've noticed that you're right. The change has to occur first and foremost in Ankara. And I would argue that there's been some hesitancy here in Washington to accept the new realities that Turkey has helped create. Like Turkey, in its desire to become a regional hegemon, has taken all these new directions, whether it's on arms sales or support for all these like regional military projects. All this that Turkey's done is basically saying they're not willing to play second fiddle to U.S. or NATO. They are their own power, and that upset decades of thinking here in Washington. For decades, I would argue, since the mid 1920s, the deal was something like this with the new republic, that the West would have in Turkey a regional partner on all sorts of issues, whether they're energy or containing the Soviets or the Dardanelles or whatever. All these Turkey would be a regional partner, and in turn the West would turn a blind eye to the treatment of minorities and other at-risk populations within the borders of present-day Turkey, and would leave the past behind. That was what the U.S. and the West were willing to do, and you saw that in British policy and in U.S. policy, certainly, at least on Armenian issues, certainly. So now Erdogan, in the last 10, 20 years, has decided that deal, he doesn't like his part of the deal, which is being a regional partner, being a second fiddle. So he leaves that deal, and for year after year, after he made it very clear that he's no longer going to abide by that covenant or that arrangement, for years, DC was so slow to catch up to that, and always in the mode of how do we salvage it, how do we save it, how do we go back, Erdogan will come and go. What can we do, going forward to bring things back to the way they were? If all we have to do is ignore the suffering of minorities and turn a blind eye to genocide, well, heck, that's a small price to pay for a regional ally. Erdogan decided, he would of course have both. He would I'm not a regional ally, and you don't say anything about my minorities or my past. That deal is falling apart mostly at the congressional level, and lower down in the system. But I think, and I could be wrong on this, John, you deal with this every day, as do we, but your perspective is a little bit different. It seems like there are still folks within the U.S. Leadership who are doing their best to manage or salvage or save or reset, whatever word people want to use, to try to get things back on track with Turkey, as if they can go back to a pre-Erdogan era, or as if they can develop a post-Erdogan vision that'll, put the relationship back on track. I'm not so sure that's possible, and I think the sooner that DC wakes up to what Erdogan has chosen for his country, and maybe not just Erdogan, maybe just the elites in Turkey have decided this is the direction, and if Erdogan, left the scene tomorrow, not a whole lot would change. I suspect that's true. But do you get the sense that DC is waking up to Turkey, or is it a slower process? Maybe it's faster. I tend to be cynical about these things. But what's your sense? What's your sense of that?
Aram, I think I'm with you on this. The thing is, I mean, waking up from sleep, it's a quicker thing than waking up from a coma, and I think that's what the US is. It's waking up from a coma, and I actually think that a lot of people in DC or the institutions in DC were in kind of a state of shock, to be honest, because things have been going this way for at least 10 years. And here we are still in 2021 talking about could there be a reset? I mean, I'm trying to think. Do American decision makers not watch Turkish TV? Do they not watch or do they not read Turkish columnists? Especially TV stations and media outlets and the written media that are really extensions of the Turkish government right now. Do they really not take note of what's being said and written on these outlets? Because things have changed in Turkey. Turkey has changed. Just think. I was watching a program yesterday. The US has provided the Turkish army and the Turkish state money, military equipment, intelligence to really, wage this 4-decade-old war against the PKK and the Kurds. The US has been very open about its support, and it still is. And yet, Turkish government officials and all those cronies that they have in the media are claiming that the US wants to form a Kurdish state with the PKK. Really mind-boggling conspiracy theories like this. And I just think that DC simply doesn't understand the transformation that's gone on in the Turkish establishment. And that's why I believe it's in a state of shock. I mean, I think a lot of American decision makers are just thinking, how can an ally that we've spent, so much money, effort, that we have such deep military ties with, suddenly turn on us like this? I just don't think that American decision makers are really grasping the gravity of the issue here. I'm not in this line of work to try and convince the US to really just forego or let go of all hope in Turkey. As a Kurd or as someone living in Turkey, I don't believe the reorientation from Turkey and completely engaging with the Eastern camp, as it's called, a Turkey aligned with Russia is a more dangerous Turkey for all the peoples living in that country, especially minorities. I don't think Putin himself or the Russian state necessarily wants to uphold any sort of universal democratic or human rights values in Turkey. They don't do that in their own country. Why would they hold Turkey to that? Now, the US does say that it wants to hold its allies and all the countries in the world to these standards. So at least with that, it's it's preferential for us people living in that country that Turkey is still engaged with the Western camp. But what we're actually asking here in DC every day is that really just uphold your values when engaging with this country for two reasons. One, it's better for us as the people who suffer on the ground every single day, but also for you, because a Turkey that upholds these values is a Turkey more prepared to engage with the West's agenda in the region and globally than it is anything else.
Let me dig into that a little bit. And there's really a lot to unpack there. It's a very, very, your analysis is really on the mark. Let me say this. I'll go back to the Armenian experience, the 2019 resolutions on the Armenian genocide. At one level, there's some desire among the advocates of that resolution to say, like, okay, this is a rebuke of Turkey, or this is going to change U.S.-Turkey relations. That's certainly there's that view. I think it's not a consensus view anyway, but it's a view. I would say the more thoughtful view is something like, whatever you think about Turkey, whatever the geopolitics of Turkey, whatever the value of Turkey is to our ambitions in the region, they don't deserve a veto over this particular human rights issue. This is a historical issue of the case of genocide. Their relationships should not be such that they get to decide what we say and don't say on an issue of human rights and genocide. And I think that was that was the tipping point that we hit in 2019. Not necessarily that it's going to change fundamentally the U.S.-Turkey relationship, but that there's going to be a limit. There's going to be a ceiling on what Turkey can expect from that relationship. Now, that extends, I think, now to and has its own manifestation in the Kurdish space and the democracy space. And what we're seeing is U.S. policymakers starting low, moving high. That's always the way it is in politics. Change comes to Washington. Very rarely does change come from Washington, right? The change is coming to Washington that whatever we think about Erdogan, as difficult as he is, as antagonistic and hostile as he can be, we still need some sort of relationship. We're not going to, cut off diplomatic ties with Ankara, but they don't get to tell us how we relate to Kurdish issues. That Kurdish issues have their own track, and that we should engage, whether it's with the Kurds in Syria or Iran or Turkey or Iraq, wherever, right? We should engage with Kurds as a nation with aspirations, with security concerns, and that we should have that track. And the same, I think, can be said of democracy, right? For years, right, we would struggle mightily to get one person from the U.S. Embassy in Ankara to attend an Armenian observance on April 24th, the genocide observance on April 24th. And of course, they would never do that because that would go outside the bounds of the deal they have. But I think now we're seeing U.S. policymakers rethinking Turkey, and not necessarily saying Turkey's less important or more important, but saying, we're going to have common sense limits of what they can expect from this relationship. And I'll put it more bluntly, there were times when they could veto who would be represented in the U.S., right? Who would have the right to speak in the U.S. On democratic issues or on Kurdish aspirations. And I think the fact that that veto has been withdrawn is a good thing. And I think that we're moving into the realm, as you said, from the sort of like this coma to this shock, and then ultimately into the world, I think, of reason and common sense, where we can have a normal discussion, where the discussion doesn't get shut down by an angry phone call from the defense minister in Turkey to some assistant secretary of defense in Washington, and then the whole thing is silenced, and that stuff may work. I'm getting bringing my thoughts back to Sheridan Circle and the 2017 attack there. That type of tactic of beating people up seems to have its place in Turkey, and maybe it's effective at some level in Turkey. Ultimately, not long term, but it's counterproductive here. So I don't know. I guess it's a long way of saying, Giran, that you've been part of the sort of the movement toward reason and sort of a common sense understanding of these relationships, where we can talk about these things, and we can ask the question: what is the right U.S. policy on Kurdish issues? That's a fair question. It shouldn't be shut down before it even starts. And you've helped sort of foster that debate in D.C. And I think that's a great thing.
Thank you very much, Aram. No, and I think just adding to what you just said, actually, I do think that we have to kind of start from a bigger picture right now. Okay. We are in immensely exciting times. It's a strange time going forward now, and you Americans have a lot of things to deal with right now. For example, we under the previous administration, we've had some statements come out from the White House right now. We would never have gotten these statements under the previous administration. So first things first, the tenet of the White House matters. I'm a born and raised leftist, Aram, and I was raised with the popular idea that who wins American elections doesn't matter. I think the last 4 years have shown us that they do. They simply do. Now, the US has very strong institutions, but presidential elections matter, and I think that's the first thing. Ankara decided to leave the Istanbul Convention against violence against women. I mean, it's a very basic thing. The White House came out with a statement and said that this was wrong. Now, I'm almost certain, as I'm sure very many of our listeners will be, that this statement simply wouldn't have been made under the previous administration. Secondly, the bigger picture that I'm talking about is that the US's global influence a lot of people say it's receding, and I think the numbers back that up. It is receding. Now, all the think tanks in DC are reorganizing themselves to counter this threat from China, and a lot of what I've read claims that the threat from China, the challenge from China, is a much more substantial threat than what the Soviet Union ever was. So everyone's preparing themselves to face this new challenge. And I think this is where people like us can come into the debate. Now, economically, I'm not a financial expert. I'm not an economic expert, but the figures speak for themselves. China is expanding its influence. China is enriching itself. China is having it's having a bigger economic and financial influence, definitely over in its region, but globally as well. So, with all of these said, how can the US sustain its influence on the way the world is managed? And I really think that in this current climate, it all does come down to what kind of life we want to live, what kind of cultural paradigm, what kind of political paradigm people want to live in globally. The US has one model, the West, the liberal international order, as it's called, has one political cultural model that it can present to humanity, and the rising challengers have an alternative one. And if the US now, as you quite rightly said, if the US wants to sustain what influence it has right now, it really has to be a little bit more principled in standing up for the universal values and standards that it set itself for the rest of the world, and then give the people of the world an option. You have that model that's rising in the East. You have this model that's the Western model, and we'll let people decide which one they prefer. But in order for the people to be able to decide, you have to be principled. I mean, to be honest, China's very principled in what it does. China doesn't bend the rules for anyone. I mean, China has its own model, and it's very, very principled from what I can see. Now, if the US, financially, it's much more difficult to compete with China than what it previously was. So that's not an area that the US can hegemonize anymore. China's pretty good at that as well. So that's not an area that the Americans can hegemonize or the West can hegemonize. But what the US really does have going for it is the values that it represents. And in order for that to work, it just has to be more principled in the way it stands up for them. And Turkey's not a country like Saudi Arabia or the relationship between Turkey and the US is much more dynamic, and that's why you simply cannot put Turkey into a category whereby you say, okay, you can do whatever you want domestically, you can repress whatever you want, you can be as anti-democratic as you possibly want as long as you're in my camp. You simply cannot implement that formula with Turkey, because the only reason Turkey remains in the Western camp is because it can benefit from the political paradigm that the West represents. So is it any coincidence that as the authoritarian downturn, the democratic backsliding in Turkey has coincided with Turkey buying the S-400s or getting closer to Russia, or building more economic ties with countries like Iran and China? They're simply, I don't think that's a coincidence. And so this is where the interests of the peoples on the ground, the people who are fighting for democracy, who are fighting for human rights, coincides with American interests. And I think that's, I'm not the young, naive version of myself that I used to be. I'm not going to convince states like the US to invest in Turkish democracy because it's the right thing to do. These states simply don't work that way. None of the states on the face of this earth work that way. None of the states simply do things because they're the right thing to do. But here, there's a really overlapping alignment between the right thing to do and American interests. And that's why I think voices like ours, there are more people willing to listen now and say, well, actually, we might have to really invest in the democratization of Turkey this time. It's not just going to go like it used to. We can't just turn a blind eye to what's going on and really bank on Turkey being our perpetual ally for any longer. We either engage with Turkey in a critical way where we stand up for our values, and we either succeed by empowering those people who are fighting for democracy in Turkey and ensure that Turkey remains a healthy democracy. Whether it ever was, that's a discussion for another day. Or we just say, okay, we'll just lose complete hope and just allow for Turkey to be the rogue actor it is right now in the region and align itself with our adversaries all over the world.
Yeah, I can't agree more. You've defined it very well, that the right thing to do and the smart thing to do in this instance are the same thing, and I think that's absolutely essential for us to understand. I look at you talk about like the soft power in an increasingly, let's say, multipolar world with China's growing influence, that for the U.S. just to bank on the numbers, the military bases, the hard power is insufficient, and and U.S. soft power is more important. And that idea of we're on the right side. Our model is the model to follow. I think that's an idea that resonates with Armenians, let's say. And then you have on the U.S. Embassy in Ankara a big billboard that says, "Don't take us seriously. We're willing to deny the genocide that very nearly eradicated your presence on the earth, but believe us when we talk about human rights and democracy and freedom and all the rest." And it's that hypocrisy, right, that undermines the credibility. So you have an Armenian nation that is drawn to all the ideals of sort of a liberal, open, democratic, tolerant, diverse system, and then the main force behind that says, okay, but here are the 18 exceptions. And I think a similar message, sadly, has been sent to Kurds in Turkey and around the region. I came to Washington in the 1990s during an era of massive arms sales to Turkey, when the U.S. and obviously the Turks knew very well that those weapons would be used by and large against domestic civilians to destroy thousands upon thousands of villages, innocent men, women, and children, to destroy a culture, to destroy a presence. So it's these experiences where the gap between what we say and what we do is so stark that undermines the very type of power that America can project around the world. So I think you're right that the smarter minds in D.C. will recognize that the hard power is not quite as available to them as before. We'll start thinking about, well, what does it take to have soft power? And probably the first thing they should think about is, well, let's stop lying about genocides. Let's stop covering up. Let's stop. How about this? Let's stop arming people to kill their own citizens. That would be a good start. And 4 or 5 other things in that area. And in that sense, right, the right thing to do becomes the smart thing to do. And I think that's why I believe essentially voices like ours are important in Washington. Not always popular in Washington. It's never. I don't think we're going to headline too many of the major think tanks anytime soon. Although that may, I don't want to rule that out either. But I think our voices are really, really important in Washington. If it was left, sure.
Just to add quickly one thing, I didn't want to interrupt, but I've been here for 3.5 years. I've not been in a single office that's turned around and said to me, "You're wrong," or that's turned around and said to me, "Well, no, I don't agree with you there." That's the sorry thing about all of this, and I think that's why I think it's important now that this city really does wake up from this coma, and coming from the UK, DC, the US government is really good at thinking, normally is really good at thinking on its feet. It's really good at adapting. It's a much more dynamic decision-making process than the states that I've had experience with in Europe, growing up in the UK. You know, the US seems to be able to take new information and adapt accordingly. But yet, on these specific issues, there's something that really incapacitates the US's thinking, and to be able to really produce just a new line or a new approach to something so very clear like this. You know, and as a Kurd, when you know the Armenian genocide, it's right there. It's right there, and it's been there for over 100 years. And you know, we've talked about this before. But just to see something like that, that's right. It's so on the nose that you know that something else is going on there. That you know that something else has to be going on behind the scenes for something so clear to be such a contentious issue in a place that has the most think tanks on the face of this earth. You know, this think tanks are where people think. And for something so clear and on the nose like this to be muzzled for such a long time really shows what we're up against. And I don't want to give the Turkish state so much credit for this. But ending maybe on a brighter note, I think the current administration and the coalition that was formed that brought this administration into government really gives us an opportunity to speak about more humane things and to try and build that connection between the right thing and the smart thing. And I for one am definitely thankful for that.
Yeah, as are we, certainly, Giran. I do want to end on a bright note, but I'm going to offer one question that will take us a little different direction, and we'll swing back to the brighter side. So the next crisis, if there is going to be a crisis, may be a banning of the HTP, and that I don't know what the timeline for that might be. It may be a day, a week, a month, I don't know, or longer. But could you just share with us a little bit about how does that play out? What might that mean for the actual members who are serving in the parliament today? What might it mean for Garo Paylan, who's of Armenian heritage? He certainly, we follow his work there very closely. Would those seats be then apportioned to other members, non-members of the HDP? Would they be reserved for the HDP for, is this a permanent ban? Is it a temporary ban? How does that play out? So if we will certainly,
let me start.
We're going to focus on this a lot. So I just want to make sure that our community is ready for what might occur.
Aram, let me start by saying this. The Turkish constitution isn't worth the paper it's written on right now. And so I'm going to find it very difficult to talk about any kind of due process and, what might happen or what the process normally is, because everything's been thrown out the window. Erdogan really does determine everything. And right now, I can tell you that the Ankara prosecutor, the main head prosecutor in Ankara, has started legal proceedings in the Constitutional Court to close the HDP. This process has officially started. The indictment is hundreds of pages long. There's a list of 600 people, current and former members of parliament, members of our executive committee, activists, HDP activists, who, the indictment wants to ban from politics for permanently, or at the very least for 5 years. So the indictment is pretty extensive. And in all honesty, I think for us as a party, we are looking at a very tough period coming up now. I mean, we've been through this for the last 5 or 6 years, but the next few weeks and months are probably going to be the most intense battles that we will have faced. Because the Turkish government, and I mentioned that that marriage of convenience was the word I was looking for earlier, between the ultra-nationalist fascist MHP and the still power-hungry Erdogan coming together and really determining the country's agenda from top to bottom. And so that's why it does seem to me that this is also in preparation for maybe an early election towards the end of this year, to polarize society as much as possible again, to consolidate the nationalist, the ultra-nationalist base, but also deterring the HDP or preventing the HDP from actually contesting the elections. Seen as they can't keep us down, they might just want to keep us out. And so that could be one of the motivations. And with Garo Paylan, I mean, you know, he's one of the most courageous people in Turkey right now. You know, there are so many people who have so many identities that are repressed by this state, and Garo Paylan probably is the champion in that. He has so many identities that are inherently or seemingly are inherent threats to the Turkish state and the establishment. And so he's always been on the sharp end. You know, he's always had to deal with the most inhumane attacks by the Turkish establishment. And, you know, he's just been incredibly courageous. He's not bowed down from anything that the Turkish government has thrown at him. And he's also one of the 600 people that the Turkish state wants to ban from doing politics in Turkey. And what a shame that would be, because he's wholeheartedly committed himself for the struggle to democratize Turkey. And yet he's now going to pay a price, you know, for simply wanting the most basic standards of democracy and human rights in a country, in his own homeland. That's his homeland, and he stuck to it. He stayed in his homeland and raised a flag for the struggle for democracy, and the Turkish state wants him to pay a price for that now. Like very many other HDP members of parliament, like many other HDP activists who are in prison right now, the government wants to really quash this movement, and you know, it's disheartening in that way. But I'll guarantee and promise everyone listening to this right now that this struggle will not go away. And I'll revert back to the joke that a lot of HDP voters and sympathizers make. You know, we haven't exhausted the letters of the alphabet yet. We'll be back. It might be 3 different letters, but this struggle will be back. And you know, the unprecedented electoral success in 2015 was 13.1%. The next 3 letters will surpass that, I promise you.
Excellent. Giran, we can't thank you enough. Your words today are very inspirational, very insightful. They mean a lot to us as Armenian Americans. They resonate greatly in our community. I know that we're going to put down all your contact information so folks can follow you on social media, you know, stay in touch with your office and show support for your work. We look forward to you know, continuing our cooperation, our partnership, you know, going forward. As things get difficult, know that we will always stand shoulder to shoulder with you and the HDP and the great work that you're doing.
ARAM, thank you very much for all the nice words, and again for having me on. And thanks institutionally to the Armenian National Committee for doing such incredible work and under so much pressure, even here in DC. You know, I think everyone sees the kind of pressure that the Turkish state wants to put on the ANCA as well, and personally to you as well. You know, I really do see you as a mentor, to be honest. To be completely honest, I've learned a lot from you, and institutionally, again, you know, the Armenian National Committee is a voice for a people that have gone through so much. And, you know, I commend every single thing you do here in DC, again, institutionally and you individually, ARAM.
Thank you, my brother. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great day.